And in a series of 4 programs that the Wilson Center will be having over the course of the next several weeks. The first one was yesterday, in which we explored economic development and its role in Arab-Israeli conflict management and resolution. Today we'll be talking about endgames, one-state, two-state solutions. On October 5th, we're going to be holding a discussion on Hamas, the U.S., and the pursuit of Arab-Israeli peace. Elliot Abrams will be coming, and we'll be talking with Robert Pastor, and I'll be offering some comment. That should be a very interesting session. And then either late October or early November, we're going to hold a session that we had to reschedule, which will bring Bill Burns from the State Department, as well as 2 or 3 other analysts to explore the Obama administration's policies in the Middle East 8-9 months after the administration took office, a sort of scorecard. So I think these sessions, the one yesterday was quite intriguing and led to some very good discussion, and I suspect today's will as well. A brief comment or two. Here we are again, another September, another UN General Assembly, another possible resumption of Arab-Israeli negotiations. Another administration trying its hand at Arab-Israeli diplomacy. This particular peacemaking process confronts old challenges. There may well be new opportunities. We're poised, or I should say I'm poised somewhere between looking at the current situation with some realism and a sort of sober assessment about how much has changed, how much hasn't, and what may well be possible in the next year or so. I think it's important that we look at the world the way it is without giving up hope on the issue of how we want the world to be. And somewhere between the two, between the way the world is and the way we want it to be, may well lie the balance and the parameters of a judicious and hopefully effective American policy. The issue of endgame, however, is extremely important. What is the objective of the exercise? What is possible, what is not possible? And to help us sort this out this morning, we have at least the matter of endgames. We're delighted to have, in my judgment, not just in mine, but judgment of many people, 2 very creative and brilliant analysts, veteran observers, in the case of Rob Malley, practitioner. They've watched this movie for a very long time, and they're going to help us sort this out. Hussein Ibish, senior fellow at the American Task Force for Palestine, the author of a brilliant new book, What's Wrong with the One-State Solution, and Robert Malley, director of Middle East North Africa at the International Crisis Group, former policy advisor in the Clinton administration. One final comment before I turn it over to Hussein, because I think the 2 of them have recently written in a way that poses the real nature of the problem, it seems to me. Hussein has quite eloquently and quite compellingly, in my judgment, full disclosure here, buried the prospects in any real sense for a one-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem. It was never a solution anyway. It was always a historical outcome at best, and a historical outcome that, according to the arc of history, could be many, many, many years into the future. Rob Malley and Hussein Aga, in a brilliant piece in the New York Times last month, in my judgment, and Rob has a different view, of course, he wrote the article, the 2 of them have compellingly, at a minimum, pointed out how difficult it's going to be to effect a 2-state solution. So in effect, if Hussein has buried the one-state solution, and Rob Malley and Hussein Aga have raised fundamental questions about the prospects for 2, where is the space within which Arabs, Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans operate in the next several years? That, it seems to me, is the fundamental question that needs to be addressed by American policymakers and by the rest of us. So the format for this morning is very simple and direct. Hussein will begin, Rob will comment, and I will offer a few concluding remarks. We'll get through all of this very quickly. and then we'll turn to your questions, and hopefully we can have we will have a very good and very lively discussion. Hussein?
Thank you. Shall I do it from here or from the podium?
It's up to you.
I'm here, so I can start now. That suits me anyway. Thank you so much, Aaron, for setting this up and moderating this and participating. And thanks to the Wilson Center, and thanks also, of course, to Mr. Malley for coming here to have this conversation. As Aaron said, I have just published this small book, long monograph, whatever you want to call it. What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda? I will not say solution, because as Aaron says, it would be at best an outcome and not a solution to anything, and I don't think it's plausible in the foreseeable future. So agenda rather than solution. Subheading, why ending the occupation and peace with Israel is still the Palestinian national goal. And it's available for hard copy purchase or free download in multiple formats on the ATFP website. So if you want to read it, you can read it for free or you can get one. And I encourage you to do that. Now, I think one of the first things I need to explain to any Washington audience is why would I address this subject, this rhetoric about a single democratic state for all Israelis and Palestinians between the river and the sea, plus all the refugees. And it's a discourse that really doesn't exist in policy circles in Washington at all. No one with any credibility or any credentials in the foreign policy community, gets remotely close to this. And so I think the question in D.C. In many people's minds is, why would you bother with this? And I think I need to begin by addressing that. It's true enough that this rhetoric and this discourse entirely exists entirely outside of the policy conversation. But in college campuses in the U.S. and Britain, and among grassroots activists in the Palestinian, pro-Palestinian Arab American communities, this rhetoric, especially among young people, among students, among the professoriate, among grassroots activists, is becoming very powerful and has a very widespread appeal because it packs a great emotional impact. It purports to have lofty goals and values, and it also serves as a convenient vehicle for rejecting anything and everything Israeli, and total confrontation. While at the same time, because it's completely divorced from not only the U.S. policy conversation, but actually the Palestinian national conversation, which is almost entirely a contest between nationalists and Islamists, it relieves you of any responsibility. I mean, you can talk this way in a vacuum because no existing political actors base their agenda or their approach or their policies on this. So it's a purely theoretical space, and I think that's very appealing to people who don't want to make any choices and don't want to be burdened with having to defend anything anybody who really does things actually does. So it is extremely appealing in academia. Now, I go through the arguments for the one-state agenda, and I think systematically rebut all of them. And then I look at why a two-state solution is still the only thing that I think will work, although I understand the problems involved. But really the first thing I want to do is sort of put this in context for those who aren't familiar with this discourse. This one-state agenda essentially emerged as an outcome or as a consequence, a symptom maybe, of the violence and despair of the Second Intifada. When the Second Intifada broke out in September 2000, it hardened attitudes on all sides, and it prompted many people on all sides to reevaluate in a negative way what kind of peace was possible and desirable. In Israel, it resulted in the collapse of the peace camp, the election of Ariel Sharon as prime minister, and the series of kind of political atmosphere in Israel that we see playing out today. Among the Palestinians in the occupied territories, it led, at least for a time, to the rise of Islamists and Hamas, not to a dominant, but to a challenging position. That seems to be somewhat in abeyance at the moment, but for how long, who knows? In the Palestinian diaspora and pro-Palestinian circles in the West, there isn't a lot of support for Hamas, and whatever there is tends to be very muted and almost subterranean, especially in the United States, because it's politically untenable and legally risky to be openly supportive of Hamas. So I think the same kind of sentiment manifested itself in the diaspora and pro-Palestinian circles in the West in many ways in this one-state agenda, which is very aggressive when it comes to anything and everything, to do with the Israeli state. It's in most of its forms, it's very confrontationalist. However, I think it's important to recognize that this isn't simply a symptom of the violence of the Second Intifada. It's more broadly a symptom of despair and disillusionment based on the failure of the peace process and negotiations to achieve the independence for the Palestinians, the end of the occupation, or any of the minimal goals that Palestinians have correctly sought. So it has led, this 15 years or so of failure and disappointment has led a lot of people to conclude that Israel will never agree, and in some cases Palestinians in Israel will never agree, but usually in this rhetoric it's Israel will never agree to really end the occupation and allow for a viable sovereign Palestinian state, and therefore negotiations are pointless, diplomacy is futile, the quest for an independent state is a dead end, and what Palestinians need is a, quote, creative solution, close quote, and to, as some people say, to stop playing the game where the deck is stacked against them and start playing another game. This is the kind of rhetoric you hear, as if it's just like easy to change the terms of reference. What I've done in this book basically is not only summarize and refute various arguments and consider the whole thing in its broad context, but I also I asked a series of rather pointed questions to one-state advocates that are either not posed or haven't been answered and certainly haven't been properly discussed or considered by their sympathizers. And I'll list a few of them. First, if Israel will not agree to end the occupation, what makes anyone think that it will possibly agree to dissolve itself? In other words, if Israel cannot be compelled or convinced to surrender 22% of the territory it holds, how could it be compelled or convinced to surrender or share 100% of it? Right? I've never heard anyone try to explain that one. And it seems to me the most obvious possible question. Second, what, as a practical matter, does this vision of a single democratic state offer to Jewish Israelis? And this is significant, of course, because this has to be based on the agreement of Jewish Israelis, unless there is a large group of one-state tank battalions of which I'm unaware. It's got to be a voluntary agreement, I would think. But there doesn't seem to be any effort to explain that at all. Thirdly, what efforts have these advocates made in reaching out to mainstream Jews and Israelis and incorporating their national narrative into this vision? As far as I can tell so far, none. And again, that begs the question of how you're going to convince people to voluntarily agree to something when you don't address their most fundamental concerns at all. Fourth, how do one-state advocates propose to supersede or transcend Palestinian national identity and ambitions? And why is it that no significant Palestinian party or faction has adopted this goal? Again, no real discussion of that. Fifth, how, apart from what I consider to be empty slogans about largely non-existent and highly implausible boycotts, do one-state advocates propose to realize or advance their vision? What practical steps do they imagine, and what is their roadmap for success? Haven't heard anything that approximates a serious discussion of that. I mean, strategy. Right? There's no strategy here. Boycott, divestment, sanctions is a wish list, which, even if it were realized, doesn't logically necessarily translate into the capitulation of Israel. Right? There's been a boycott against Palestinians from many parts of the world for the last 60 years. Didn't even dent the Palestinian national will. Right? I don't see why anyone would expect that a boycott, even if it were widespread, would simply collapse Israel's will and break the Israeli will. I don't get it at all. And finally, since they reject both Palestinian independence and the ongoing agenda of infrastructural and institutional development by what they call the Quisling Palestinian Authority, what do one-state advocates, as a practical matter, offer to those living under occupation other than expressions of solidarity and interminable decades of continued struggle and suffering? If this is going to be realized, as Aaron suggested, it can only be as the outcome of many decades of extremely brutal further bloodshed on both sides, which, generally speaking, redound becomes worse on the Palestinians than on the Israelis. The kind of mutual exhaustion and depletion, which is hard to imagine, but I suppose it could happen. But let's put it this way. If you take the bloodshed and suffering of the past 60 years, it hasn't really gotten anyone close to wanting this, as a practical matter. So just imagine the amount of violence and bloodshed that would be required in coming decades to actually get them there. We're talking about a great intensification of the conflict as the only vehicle for achieving this, in my view. Now, what's really interesting is that this book has been circulating on the internet for several weeks. And it's free for anyone who wants to read it in multiple formats. And I do believe that most of the most vocal and significant one-state advocates in this country have actually looked at it. And not one of them has made the least effort to answer any of those questions in any way whatsoever. Right? They appear to be pretending that it simply doesn't exist. And one is getting the impression of perhaps a small child putting his fingers in his ears and singing, la, 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 I can't hear you. Now, I think at some point there's going to have to be an answer, and I hope it's a calm and thoughtful one, although it may well be ad hominem, given the amount of time that's passing, which suggests that perhaps there isn't a reasonable answer to some or all of these questions, and that they weren't anticipated. But at some point there has to be a response, and I hope that it is serious, because there must be, obviously, a considerable burden of proof on a group of people who are suggesting that a national polity, a national movement, abandon its long-standing goal, which is, by the way, based on a huge body of international law and a regional and international consensus for ending the occupation and having a Palestinian state to live alongside Israel, for a vision that is extremely vague and undefined, to be achieved by methods unspecified, and which offers serious risks and uncertain benefits. Right? That is a position that requires, quite a burden of argumentation, and they're just going to have to pony up at some point. I think that the silence is extremely telling. It speaks volumes. It's a more eloquent answer than anything else, and it's entirely vapid and vacuous. Now, I think in this context, in the context of this panel, sitting with the distinguished colleagues to my right here, it is important to recognize that there are many people who have raised very valid, very legitimate, and very serious doubts about the achievability of a two-state agreement under the present circumstances. And both Dr. Miller and Mr. Malley have expressed those views at different times. But I think we have to start an evaluation of any suggestion like that with two fairly obvious points, which I don't think are disputed by any serious commentator. First, that there is no military victory which resolves the conflict available to either parties. Right? And second, the status quo is untenable and unacceptable to both parties. Neither Israel nor the Palestinians are going to go away or capitulate and abandon their national identities or projects. Therefore, in the absence of a resolution or a process leading towards a resolution, conflict will continue, and there will be a generalized relationship of violence and indeed warfare. Now, it strikes me that anyone who wishes to conclude, or does conclude, that a two-state peace agreement is either unachievable or undesirable has a political and, I would argue, even a moral obligation to propose a workable alternative. Right. Let me stress, this alternative has to be acceptable to both parties to be meaningful, which is to say it has to meet the minimum national requirements of both Israel and the Palestinians. So that's one of the reasons why I decided to write this book, because while the one-state agenda might conceivably be acceptable to many Palestinians, it obviously won't be to most Jewish Israelis, and they will fight against it vigorously and virtually unanimously. And the same thing applies, by the way, to ideas that keep circulating on the Israeli right about an arrangement whereby the Egyptians are somehow forced or compelled to take over responsibility for Gaza again, and same thing with Jordan in parts of the West Bank that Israel doesn't want to retain, and that in that way Israel can resolve the situation without ever making an agreement with the Palestinians. Again, it's a fantasy because it is not acceptable to the other side. Neither the Palestinians, the Egyptians, or the Jordanians will accept it. So it's a non-starter. So what I'm saying is that any idea that people put forward as a working alternative that is obviously going to be totally unacceptable to the vast majority of people on both sides based on their minimal national interests is not a real alternative. It's an excuse for not having an idea, and it's a sort of changing the subject. And in effect, it is to kind of accept the status quo and say that, well, it's absolutely fine. Or it's not fine, but there's not much we can do about it. I think it's a little bit like saying, well, we probably can't do much politically to sell climate change, therefore we just should not bother with trying to correct that problem. I don't think it's a workable approach. Now, as far as alternatives go, one thing we could focus on as a practical point of view in the coming year and a half, 2 years that Dr. Miller referred to, which is neither a two-state agreement as such, nor a one-state fantasy, is the program of the Salam Fayyad government for moving towards what he has termed de facto statehood. That is with an eye to creating a new reality which neither Israel nor the international community can ignore, in which the Palestinians not only can govern themselves, they are governing themselves. I think it's a brilliant plan if you can make it. The only question is, can he make it work with the appropriate commitment from the rest of the Palestinians in the West Bank, and with the appropriate international support? I think he could make really great headway in that direction. But the ultimate goal, both of that de facto statehood and of international diplomacy in the area, has to be to get towards a conflict-ending two-state agreement. I think in my book I've said that concluding that a two-state agreement is no longer possible in the way that most one-state advocates do, by pointing at geographical and infrastructural changes that Israel has created on the ground and administrative changes that it's created on the ground. In other words, the mechanics, the mechanism of the occupation, what Jeff Halper has called the matrix of control. I think it's quite a felicitous phrase. Is I think the wrong way of looking at things, because administrative measures and even physical realities like settlements and walls and whatnot are subject to political will. Right? Things can change; they can be changed. Right? And I think a much more realistic and political way of looking at it, and I think serious way of looking at it, is that the benchmark for concluding that a two-state agreement is impossible is much more reasonably framed in terms of when a majority, and a solid majority over a sustained period of time, of both Israelis and Palestinians conclude that it isn't possible or isn't desirable. As long as you have strong majorities on both sides that are in favor of this, or even slight majorities on both sides that are in favor of this, it is a plausible way forward over the long run. And I think that what one has to kind of keep in mind is that the choice is not between a whole bunch of different interesting creative options that will work. The choice is pretty stark. It's really between war and peace. Now, as long as you're moving in the direction of statehood, diplomatically and in terms of changes on the ground through a de facto state development project, then I think violence could be contained. However, any time the atmospherics suggest that the occupation is entrenching itself and that there's no way out and no way forward and no prospect of freedom and independence, I think you're absolutely going to have further conflict. Now, I just want to conclude by saying, as I told Aaron in an email the other day, I am not now, nor have I ever been, a member of the Optimist Party. I don't have any illusions about the obstacles facing the realization of such an agreement, as Mr. Malley has pointed out, and as Dr. Miller has pointed out as well on many occasions. And there is indeed a possibility, and you could argue, I don't agree with this, but you could even argue a probability that such an agreement can't be reached. However, given the lack of plausible, workable alternatives and the grim reality of the consequences of what a failure to achieve such an agreement would be, the only constructive course is to work to achieve it nonetheless. Now, rather than taking time to explain how difficult this is going to be, I think a more constructive application of energy would be to trying to find a way to somehow make it work, because I do think it is the only thing that can work. Past administrations have tried to avoid this problem from the American point of view, and they've been unable to do it. This thing has a way of coming back to bite you in the backside. It just can't, it really can't be ignored. And it can't be managed, because due to many factors, including settlements and hardening of sentiments on all sides, and the violence, which of the occupation and violent resistance, this conflict is continuously deteriorating. It is becoming more and more difficult to find a solution to it. So the idea that it can be managed in a successful way, I think, is as illusory as this one-state idea. And I think that the idea that the United States can sort of walk away from this or afford not to resolve it, I think is absolutely wrong. I don't see any viable alternatives in the long run to a two-state agreement, although it may require stages to get there, such as de facto statehood, which I think is a very plausible and interesting idea. But I don't think in the long run there's any other option. So what we should do is think, in the most serious way possible, how to get towards that goal. And I think, if you're looking for creative ideas, Salam Fayyad's program is probably the best one I've seen in a long time. It is creative, it's doable, it's something the Palestinians can do without Israeli approval. It will definitely change the mechanics and the atmospherics and the realities. And so if we're talking in those terms, I think we should think very carefully about that. So thanks very much.
Hussein, thank you very much. Rob?
Do you have to press or no?
No.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Hussein, and thanks for all of you for being here. I start from a very simple, straightforward premise, which is that 15 years after Oslo, everything that has been tried has failed. There were negotiations when you had a powerful representative, sort of larger-than-life Palestinian leader, and strong-willed and credentialed Israeli prime ministers. That was the case in the 1990s. There were instances where the U.S. took a step back, as it did at the beginning of the Clinton presidency, and periods when it took a more proactive posture, as it did towards the end of his second term. There were periods when the Arab countries were left on the sidelines, and others, as since the introduction of the Arab Peace Initiative, when they tried to play a more active role. And there were times when you had Israeli and Palestinian leaders who seemed to be more or less on the same wavelength when it came to efforts to achieve a two-state solution. I'm thinking of the period between President Abbas and Prime Minister Olmert. And there were times when the international community took a more passive role, and times, again, as in the past, when they were not only more active but more unanimously backing the concept of a two-state solution. All of those attempts for the last many years have failed. And as the President said last night, those are just the facts. The question is what you do with them, but that's just a statement of fact, that nothing that's been attempted so far has succeeded. Now, one could have two reactions to that situation. One reaction is to jump from the failures of the past and the present to the unrealism of the future, and that's the topic of Hussein's masterful deconstruction of the one-state advocacy. And it is the notion that because the two-state solution or efforts to achieve it haven't worked, we're going to go for something that's even harder to achieve, which is one state. And for me, the basic test of an idea which is perhaps ethically and morally appealing, but ultimately fallacious, is that it misses it can't pass the primal test, which is, does it satisfy the basic needs of both sides? It doesn't satisfy, at a minimum, the basic need of Israeli Jews, as Hussein demonstrated, and therefore, however much some people may find it appealing, it simply is a non-starter. So I think that is the first instinct of people who say something didn't work, so let's go for something wholly different, even if it doesn't have much of a chance, if any chance, of being achieved. But then there's a second temptation, which is a temptation that is more in vogue in Washington than the former one, which is to say it didn't work not because there was something that we didn't get right fundamentally, but because we have to tinker with a piece of the effort that perhaps we didn't, it wasn't adjusted perfectly. And so we've identified some of the reasons why the efforts of the past haven't worked. There was not enough attention to facts on the ground, and therefore there was too much of a discrepancy between what was said at the negotiating table and what was happening in settlements and in terms of Palestinian activity in the occupied territories. That's one reason that's been mentioned. There was a lack of trust between the two sides. Perhaps the Arabs should have been more involved earlier. Perhaps the Europeans should have been more involved earlier. Maybe we didn't find exactly the right equilibrium when it came to the territorial percentages or to the solution on Jerusalem. And then, of course, there's the answer that we're hearing more and more today. The reason that it hasn't succeeded is because the U.S. didn't take a proactive enough position, which usually means, it usually is a code word for saying the U.S. hasn't pressured Israel enough. And that's the second mindset, which is to say, we just have to tinker with what we've done in the past, and this time we'll get it right. Now, maybe it's possible that, and I've argued in the past that a number of these things should have been differently. But do we really think that if we got the territorial percentages a little bit differently, or if there had been less settlement activity, or if the Arab world had been a little more involved, things would have been fundamentally different? That that's what has made the difference between serial failure and success? And as for the latest, or the idea that is most mentioned today, which is it's the matter of the U.S. and the Obama administration being much more forceful, much more sort of putting a plan on the table, and more or less imposing it, I asked two questions. One, is there a level of pressure that the U.S. can exert that would convince Israeli and Palestinian leaders to do something that under other circumstances they would not do? In other words, to go against what they perceive to be either their national or their political interest. And if there is that level of pressure that the U.S. can exercise, is it realistic that it will do so? And ultimately, it doesn't really matter which of those two you answer no to. But I don't believe that we can imagine a situation where the U.S. will or can put that kind of pressure that will compel the parties to do something that politically they don't think they should do for domestic reasons or they can do in terms of their national ethos and their expectations of what a fair solution should be. So then we're left with the fact of the question that Aaron put, well, if the one-state solution is a fantasy, and if the efforts at achieving a two-state solution and even adjustments to those efforts are unlikely to achieve a result, and as I say, I think we should make all of these changes, but I'm quite skeptical that that's at its core the reason why we haven't achieved a solution, we're left with the question, what do we do? Now, I have not given up on the two-state solution, contrary to what some people may have drawn from the op-ed that Hussein, the other Hussein and I wrote and that Aaron referred to. I've not given up on the two-state solution. I've soured on the methods that have been used to achieve it so far. I think there's something that's been missing at a fundamental methodological, psychological, political view, political standpoint, which has accounted for the failure far more than the tinkering and the adjustments that people are thinking of right now. And I think if we don't ask those questions, why it's failed and what possibly has been missing in the way we've approached it, we're condemned to repeat the mistakes of the past. And I think in terms of that methodology, two issues are worth discussing and exploring. Now, of course, there's the other option, which I think Aaron alluded to, which is to say, let's lower our sights, and maybe the best we can achieve is something less than a conflict-ending two-state solution. And that may well be the case. And there's a menu of options that one could consider, which will not be wholly satisfying to either party, but which entail less than a conflict-ending two-state solution. But if one is looking, it still has that goal, which is the optimal goal. Two issues I'd want to put on the table. One is whether at some level we've missed some of the fundamental actors that need to be involved in the process. And that the fact is we've done the least to influence or to bring in the actors, Palestinian or Israeli, who can do the most to derail the process. Whether it's the right-wing or settler constituency in Israel, the religious constituency in Israel as well, or whether it's the Islamist or the diaspora refugee community in Palestine. They may not be the ones who are most likely to endorse a two-state solution, but without their endorsement, without at some level them at least acquiescing in the outcome, it's very hard to see how you achieve a solution, let alone how you sustain it and implement it if you do reach an agreement. And that's because they're often the most mobilized, the most passionate, and the most able of taking action to undo whatever efforts are being made at the time. And I think we need to find a way, and this is partly, I assume, the discussion you'll have in next month on Hamas, but I think it goes well beyond Hamas. It is the question of the settler community. Are there ways, and the diaspora, are there ways to make sure that whatever solution, the process and the solution you're working at, take into account their interests to some extent, rather than treat them either as afterthoughts or as lepers whose interests need not be considered. That's the first point. The second one, which really was the object of the op-ed, is whether at a substantive level, the core issues, the issues that we've been dealt with, Jerusalem, settlements, how you find compensation for refugees, security, whether at some level they have missed the main point, or one of the main points, if the goal again is to resolve and end the conflict once and for all. And that's the fact that the conflict, for better or for worse, began in 1948. It wasn't triggered by 1967. And therefore the notion that you can end the conflict that began in 48 merely by addressing the issues that emerged in 67, and this is not a new idea, but it's an idea that people tend to forget, that idea may simply be, that notion may be an illusion. And we're hearing it in the voices and the debates that Israelis and Palestinians are in the midst of as we speak. When Israelis speak about the need for Israel to be recognized as a Jewish state, that goes back to an aspiration not of 1967, but of 1948. That's what the Jewish people sought to achieve in Palestine and Israel, which is making sure that they're recognized, that they're viewed as legitimate, and that the enterprise of having a Jewish homeland on that land is accepted by the region, by the people. Palestinian struggle began also, and to that extent, is rooted in 1948, not in terms of the right of return. Let's forget about the right of return, but the rights of refugees and the fact that something happened in 1948 that most Palestinians, if not all Palestinians, cannot afford to explain away as simply a historical mistake. They can't accept the fact, just as Jews can't accept the fact that they won't be accepted legitimately as an entity in the region. Palestinians can't accept the fact they've been fighting since 1948 and it all was just a tragic mistake, in which case it was probably a tragic crime. No, so they want recognition that something tragic happened to them in 1948 and they need acknowledgement and some form of reparation. And every effort, when we go through the peace process, we're talking about Jerusalem, we're talking about settlements, but then at some point it's as if those ghosts of the past come back and one party or the other will raise an issue which goes to the core of whether this issue can be actually resolved once and for all. And so the paradox is that when Israel wants a resolution of the conflict, it says it wants to resolve the conflict within the borders of 67, which is a rational and I believe the only way you're going to resolve it. But what they want in exchange is an end of the conflict, recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, and an end of all claims. In order to get to that outcome, you're going to have to go back to the issues of 1948. You can't pay with the currency of 67 to get an outcome that relates to the conflict of 1948. Now, this doesn't mean, as again some people have interpreted, that Israel has to forsake its character as a Jewish state, or that Palestinian refugees have to return, but it means that we have to grapple with those questions if the goal, again, is not simply to have a peaceful outcome, which may well last for a long time, but an end of conflict and the genuine peace that on paper both sides want and that both sides say and that the United States says it's striving to achieve. So that's the methodological question that we're raising, which is, can we rethink the way we've approached it? The solution may look very much like the Clinton parameters, TABA, regardless, but the way in the constituencies that are addressed, the way in which they're addressed, the issues that are put on the table, those may well have to change again if we're trying to achieve the goal that Hussein so eloquently describes in his book. Because, the question again is, will the end of the occupation, which will achieve a lot for both sides, and particularly for the Palestinians, and so I don't mean in any way to diminish the importance of it, but will the end of the occupation end the conflict on its own? And if it doesn't end the conflict, can you actually end the occupation? Are the Israelis prepared to end the conflict if in exchange they don't get the kind of recognition, the kind of acceptance that their struggle has been about? So I don't want to be misunderstood. As Aaron said, I'm not optimistic that in the short term one could get to these issues. And so maybe we have to lower our sights for the coming period, for the next few years. But I certainly have not endorsed the one-state solution, which I think is a fantasy. And I've not given up on the two-state solution. As I say, I've given up on the tired methods and the tired way that we've been going about it time and again, always looking for the element that will make it perfect. We'll never get to that perfection anyway. The Israeli leadership will never be exactly what we want. The Palestinian leadership will never be exactly what we want. U.S. intervention will never be as much as some people are dreaming for. We'll never get that alignment of stars. We're going to deal with the politics as they are. And given those politics, are there different ideas that need to be put on the table to try to get to the core of the issue and try to achieve the same goal, only this time going about it in a different way, perhaps a more creative way, and perhaps a more successful one? Thank you.
I must say, and I've participated in many of these things, the quality of the presentation and the brilliance and articulation of the ideas here was really, really impressive. And I want to thank both of you.
Thank you.
In advance. I'll do it again. Let me just offer a few more conventional assumptions and ideas, and then we'll go quickly to your questions and discussion. Number one, I think it's unmistakably clear to all but the most obtuse that the issue is not whether or not you can produce a one-state solution, but whether and how to produce a two-state solution. Now, producing a two-state solution, number two, is worth the effort because it is the least worst outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is the only logical, rational approach which addresses the essence of the problem, notwithstanding Rob's assertions with respect to 1948. Palestinians and Israelis have a proximity problem driven by demography, psychology, politics, and the one reality that nationalism and ethnic and sectarian corporatism was the most dominant idea in the 19th century, persisted to be the most dominant idea of the 20th, and remains to this day the dominant organizing principle which human beings use to identify and associate themselves. Vibrant nationalism. It breaks down, but it's still that kind of corporatism. And that means essentially that Palestinians and Israelis possess a national identity. Only through negotiations and separation will this fatal embrace, driven by proximity, be resolved. There's no other way, no other alternative, unless you consider the arc of history over the next century or two. And who knows what the outcome could be. Number three, let me be very clear so that both of my colleagues understand my perspective here. I have not abandoned the hope in a two-state solution. At the same time, I will assert to all of you, as I've asserted elsewhere, to me, it is very difficult to imagine an Israeli prime minister and a Palestinian president stating within the next several years to their respective publics the following: the conflict between us is over. All of the core issues, Jerusalem, borders, security, and refugees have been resolved. All claims have been adjudicated. All irredenta have been abandoned. We do not love you, In time, we may. But our business has concluded. It is almost unimaginable, given the realities in Israel, within the Palestinian national movement, the issues that divide the parties, and the conventional limitations of the mediator, which Rob Malley has so eloquently identified. It's hard for me to conceive of this outcome in the next several years. That does not mean we should abandon it. We should look at alternatives. Rob has suggested we enlarge the problem as a way to resolve it, which is actually quite wise. Because arguably by putting more on the table, even though you enlarge the nature of the problem, maybe, just maybe, you'll find a way to meet the core needs of the parties. I don't know if that's the case. And finally, I would only assert to you, whatever the policies of the Obama administration, that the real challenge for us is to identify the political space that now exists between a solution that is truly fantastical, which is really an outcome, and an excruciatingly painful solution, which may be achievable, but will represent, as I've said elsewhere, 1,000 days of root canals on the part of the mediator. Finally, and I'll quote Reinhold Niebuhr here, who said more than half a century ago that America cannot manage history, the currents of history. Look at Iraq. Look at Afghanistan. Now, what America can do with respect to the currents of history is working with strong leaders with vision who feel an urgency, compelled to resolve conflict. America can do much in those circumstances. And I hope those elements will emerge, because I do, as Hussein eloquently described, fear the consequences and the outcome if they don't. So we'll pause, stop our comments, and go to your concerns, questions, and issues. Yes, could you identify yourself?
Yes, I'm Herbert Grossman. I'm a retired federal judge. And I happen to be very pro-Israel. Let me say I have no disagreement with anything that Mr. Ibish said. And I think the solution, and I'm in favor of a two-state solution, which I distinguish from a two-state agreement, because I think a two-state agreement now would be the kiss of death. It would mean war within the next few months in the Middle East. I think the Palestinian side is not ready for that. I'm in favor of what, even though I've heard criticism of what Fayyad's plan is, I am in favor of that. I think the way to peace in the Middle East is to have a de facto Palestinian regime and people that more and more accept the idea of a two-state solution, not just parrot the line that they're willing to do it and use it as a stage in the destruction of Israel, but really work as a state and build up institutions and stop the propagandizing against Jews and against Israel. And I think that without an agreement, if that happens, there will be a two-state solution, because Israel is not interested in political control over Arabs or Palestinians. They are merely exercising security control. And the more the situation becomes secure, the more they will withdraw their forces. And they actually had withdrawn their forces.
Judge, do you have a question you'd like to address to either? No, I'm serious. I'm not trying to cut you off, but we're trying to.
If I'm not saying anything constructive, you can cut me off.
No, I want to give them a chance to respond to you.
There is a substantial number of Jews who would agree to a two-state solution under those circumstances, and that it has nothing to do with 1948 refugees. It goes back to 1936. But if you change the mindset of the Palestinians, and Arafat had a chance to do it if he really wanted to.
Right. Part of the problem is we have. I mean, okay. Thank you for your comment.
But what I'm saying is, you do have a two-state solution now, and it will automatically become some sort of de jure two-state solution when the circumstances in the Palestinian territories change.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you. Ziad, I want to welcome Ziad Asala, who's head of American Task Force for Palestine. Ziad, it's good to see you.
Thank you, Aaron. Always a pleasure to see you. I congratulate all of you for an excellent, excellent presentation. Just a couple of comments about this issue. I think what we do have now is not a two-state solution. What we do have now actually is a one-state solution with a one state controlling another people within its borders. What we aspire for as a solution is a two-state solution. There is a difference here. And I do want to visit the Fayyad vision for a minute, which is to create the infrastructure of a state while we're waiting for all these very, very complicated problems to be resolved. The only really serious problem with it is that it cannot be done without a settlement freeze. You cannot continue talking about a state to be born while the land is being eroded. So laying the blame on the Palestinians for failing to comprehend what it takes in change of their attitude is part of the what's wrong with the formula. The other part, of course, is this continuous encroachment on the land that prevents a viable state.
Can I make also one more comment about the judge's remarks? I think we're in broad agreement about what should happen, but I think that both Israelis and Palestinians and their friends in the United States, in the majority, say they want the same thing. They both say, well, we want the two states, but the other side, for whatever reason, they're not telling the truth. They're just saying something in order to, in the case of skepticism about Israel, they say Netanyahu says he's in favor of two states, but what he really means is he just wants time to build more settlements, entrench the occupation, etc. On the Israeli side, well, Palestinians say they want two states, but what they really want is the first in a plan of phases to eliminate Israel. So you've got two groups of people saying they want the same thing, convinced that they mean it, but the other side doesn't. And I think one of the challenges here is to find a way to demonstrate that actually both sides are sincere when they say they want the same thing. The second thing is that I'd point you to the Fatah General Congress, in which there was a lot of rancorous debate about a lot of things, except the national strategy of a two-state solution through negotiations with Israel. About that, there was virtual unanimity, and so I think that was a very eloquent statement of the commitment of the largest single Palestinian political movement to this goal. The third thing is that I agree that there are some Israelis who see the occupation in terms of the question of security, and it's a major issue, and I don't dismiss it at all. But of course, there's also the question of settlements, and settlements actually make Israel less secure. I think taking large numbers of your citizens and civilians and pushing them into this situation, requiring the army to dig further, dig deeper, become more entrenched, and making the solution ultimately much more difficult, the barrier between the two states ultimately much more difficult to attain, is not a security consideration. That's not a security move. That's an ideological move, and that's a political move. So it isn't just about security. There are other agendas in Israel as well. So that's all I wanted to say.
Gaith.
Thank you. Gaith Al-Omari from ATFP as well. My question is to Rob, actually. The idea of dealing with 48 and with narrative is one that we actually tried during the negotiations. We tried it in Camp David, we tried it in Taba, and frankly, I found when we were doing this that we and the Israelis were talking from two different paradigms. And I come to a conclusion that negotiators, lawyers, politicians are not the best equipped to deal with such issues of history and identity. And actually this will get us down into a never-ending discussion. It was your fault, no, it was your fault. So my question to you is, how do you deal with these big, complex, deep, time-consuming issues without overloading a negotiation process? How can you make sure that these things do not block the possibility of productive negotiations, and we don't get a repeat of Camp David and Taba, where actually often history and narrative were used as a way of not dealing with concrete issues? Thanks.
It's a good question, and I don't have the answer. I don't know how you deal with it because we haven't done it successfully. It's not a matter. I don't view this as both sides have to agree on a common narrative. I think that's not the kind of enterprise I'm thinking of. I'm just thinking, can you find a way to address both sides? Palestinian desire for acknowledgement of what happened in '48 and Israeli desire to be recognized legitimately and rightfully as the homeland of the Jewish people. But what I'm saying is, the fact is that Camp David, Taba, they all failed. I don't think they failed because of the discussion on the narratives, but they failed, and they failed to end. And if the goal is to end the conflict, again, part of the question is what the goal is. Again, Aaron put it at the beginning. He said maybe there are other goals you can achieve, but what he said he can't foresee is the two sides saying, "This is it. Finish, no more." To get to that, you do really have to get to the core so that both sides feel like their core aspirations have been met. So maybe we do have to redefine what our goal is and put on another track the attempt to actually end the conflict, which is, and then you have to think of what each side is prepared to give if what they're getting is less than full satisfaction of their core needs. So, I think you raise a fair point, and I must say, until not long ago, I was absolutely in your camp, and I remember we agreed that the notion of trying to discuss these historic issues would be more of a burden, and it's not. It should be. One should wait for later to do that. The question, of course, as I repeat myself, is what can you achieve until you've addressed those? And it may be, Aaron suggested the notion of a long-term interim, that there may be other ideas that we have to play with. I'm not satisfied with the notion of saying, well, it's too hard to deal with those, so we're going to go back and once again try to deal with Jerusalem and refugees, and as we've done in the past. And the episode of President Abbas negotiating with Prime Minister Olmert, there are many reasons why those negotiations didn't succeed. Olmert was at the end of his term. Abbas faced a divided Palestinian entity, and the Bush administration may not have played its cards as wisely as it could have. But nonetheless, and I know this, many Israelis certainly feel this way, it meant something that the proposal that Olmert put to Abbas, which went beyond what other prime ministers had put, and probably beyond anything that Prime Minister Netanyahu could put on the table, that didn't work. What does it tell us about going back to that same methodology? Now, you may be right that what I'm suggesting is going to be just as complicated, if not more, but I think it at least is a call for us to try to think more creatively. And there's some people, including some in this room, I know Jerome Siegel has thought along these lines of what can you do to mix up the issues so that, in fact, without reaching agreement on narratives, you're acknowledging their importance to both sides.
Can I comment on that? No. Well, I wanted permission, but I'm going to do it anyway. No, it strikes me, though, that without necessarily getting Palestinians to embrace the Israeli national narrative as valid, or getting Israel to embrace the Palestinian national narrative as valid, which, by the way, is one of the real advantages of a two-state solution, that you will have your society over here with your narrative, and we have our country here with our narrative, and there may be Arabs in the Jewish state and Jews in the Arab state, but, this is basically, these are the two states, and we will relate to each other through normal diplomatic processes and diplomatic relations and so forth. That's, I think, one of the beauties of a two-state solution, is that it actually doesn't require a reconciliation of narratives, but I think it does address the two things that you identified, the question of acceptance of Israel as a Jewish state and the problem of the refugees. Does it address them to the absolute satisfaction of both sides? Probably not. But if given the Arab Peace Initiative, I think it's pretty clear that one of the benefits to Israel of achieving an end of conflict agreement with the Palestinians will be widespread recognition and diplomatic relations with the Arab states. And whether people put forward a working definition of the Jewish character of Israel or not, that will be practical diplomatic recognition, and it will be the realization of what might be one of the most important foreign policy goals that Israel has had since its founding. So that's, I think, part of the mix already. of the question of moving towards two states. As for the refugees, I think we all agree that the right of return for millions of people is unlikely to be secured by an agreement. However, there are really important benefits to a two-state agreement that people don't usually talk about for refugees. First of all, there'll be a place for the refugees to go. And I'm particularly thinking of the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, who live in a totally unacceptable, outrageous situation, and for whom the problem has been one of life and death and might again be one of life and death. We're talking about a couple of 100,000 people here who essentially need to be rescued. And there are others who might, really benefit from the ability to go and live in a Palestinian state as Palestinians. That's first thing. Second thing, some form of compensation, recognition of the tragedy, etc., is likely to be part of this, and that's again much better than what has been achieved until now for the refugees, which is exactly nothing. And finally, the refugees would have an advocate on the world stage. There would be a state to represent their interests, and I think the Palestinian state would represent the interests of Palestinian refugees. And so, while that is not the right of return, which is not available, it is also a hell of a lot better than nothing.
Yes, over here.
Yeah, I raised this issue yesterday, and since it just came up again, I'd like to question it, and that is basically there are a massive number of people in both the West Bank and Gaza who are living in refugee camps administered by the UN. Refugee is basically someone who's temporarily displaced until such time as things return to the way they used to be and should be, and they can go home. And the problem is that's not going to happen. And is there any chance for peace as long as so many people live in refugee camps and consider themselves primarily refugees as opposed to potential builders of a new nation? Do we have to shut down the refugee camps right now?
Hussein?
Well, I don't think you can shut down the refugee camps right now, but I think the transition from refugee to citizen of a republic is exactly what we're talking about. And I think, the majority of people in Gaza and significant population in the West Bank are refugees, and they are part of the nascent citizenry of the potential Palestinian state. So obviously they will be part not only of the populace, but part of the leadership of that state. And I think once statehood is established, then the biggest issue involving Palestinian refugees that has to be addressed right away is the problem of the refugees in Lebanon and some other Palestinian refugee populations that, as I said, essentially need to be rescued, more or less. I think the Palestinians in Jordan, for the most part, citizens with rights, etc. Again, that is something that can be dealt with. And the majority of the rest are in the occupied territories, who I think essentially need statehood in order to rebuild their lives. And that's certainly something that can be achieved, as opposed to a return to villages that don't exist anymore and homes that have been bulldozed 60 years ago.
Just the persistence of the refugee camps and the conditions in which they live is a disgrace. And I think it's tragic to think that in order to keep the cause alive, which is really what it's about, they've lived under those conditions. The question is whether they can be convinced now that an improvement of their conditions, normalization of their conditions, doesn't come at the expense of what they think are their, the aspirations or the rights that they want to be vindicated. Part of what I think, as I said earlier, that U.S. discourse and the mediators' discourse has to reach out and talk about the refugees and the diaspora, not just about the other Palestinians. And I think President Obama did it in Cairo. I was struck by that part of his speech in which he reached out to the diaspora and the refugees. I think we need to find a way to acknowledge that they're not going to be forgotten, that we understand something happened to them, and that there's going to have to be a form of redress, but that they shouldn't be paying the price in terms of inhuman living conditions, because it really is, an outrageous and tragic fate that they've lived for all the wrong reasons.
Yes. George.
Hi, I'm George Hishmi, a journalist right now. I have a question. The issue that is very important for Palestinians is attachment to the homeland, really. I was born in Nazareth, raised in Haifa. A two-state solution doesn't solve my problem. What I have an idea, but of course I'm not a political scientist, I'll leave it up to you to work out. What about a federation between a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, where people can go to either party, see their homeland, maybe retain their property there in one way or another? What about this idea?
These ideas are in circulation. I don't think that they have, at this point, much political, they've made it into the political discourse, but there's an idea that a number of people have been talking about, which is that Palestinians could live in Israel but couldn't have voting rights. They wouldn't be citizens, they'd be citizens of Palestine. It gets very complicated. Now, I'm open to all kinds of ideas, and as I said, I think well, as you say, I mean, things have failed now, maybe we should keep our minds open, but it is an idea to have people being able to live where they want, but to retain the citizenship and the voting rights and the responsibility of their respective states. There's security issues, there are other issues that one would have to address. I think it's definitely worth, at least at academic, intellectual level, exploring, and we'd have to see whether there's any way that those could be turned into politically relevant ideas.
I can imagine scenarios like that, but they're all dependent on the existence of two states. And then once you have two states, then you can have mechanisms for exactly that. But without two states, with an occupation or I don't know what, I don't see how.
Yes, and the blue shirt. Sorry.
I'm Mitchell Plitnick. I'm the director of the U.S. Office of B'Tselem. And I was struck by something that Mr. Malley said about the failure of the peace process in part being potentially attributable to not enough attention being paid to the situation on the ground. It seems to me that we're all talking about how grim the current political climate is for actually realizing a two-state solution. I agree. But we're also seeing some signs, increased Palestinian efforts at security that are even acknowledged very strongly by the Israelis as helping to keep Israelis more secure. The easing of some travel restrictions in the West Bank that are starting to free up some parts of the Palestinian economy in the West Bank. If these efforts were expanded, the security coordination intensified, Palestinian economy really raised up, some solution found for the situation in the Gaza Strip, would this not potentially create the conditions or the political climate that is now lacking for realizing a two-state solution, at least within perhaps an Obama second term, say?
We had this discussion, part of it yesterday, when we talked about the importance of economic development in conflict management and resolution. Now, you referred to other matters, including the situation in Gaza and security issues. I mean, one of the lessons of Oslo was clearly that there are behavioral issues which American policymakers paid almost no attention to, on the assumption that you could put enough trust and currency in the bank and then you'd make a withdrawal when it came time to address the core issues. Well, the sequence in which we went from broken trust on the ground in the wake of a failed Oslo process to a gigantic leap, 0 to 60, if you will, in a matter of months to try to resolve the core issues. There was no trust and currency in the bank, none, zero, which is one of the reasons that July 2000 turned out the way that it did. So yes, you can try that. It's a variation of a bottom-up approach, as long as you understand, as you do, Mitchell, the realities that the top-down approach, the core, the territorial and identity issues which drive the conflict, will need to be addressed head-on and in ways that reflect a balance of interest between the two sides. So yeah, a marriage of the bottom-up and the top-down on paper strikes me as a very reasonable way to go. Mr. Wilcox.
I'm Phil Wilcox, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'd like to ask Rob to define, if you can, what the fundamental Israeli need is in terms of acceptance that would persuade them that the conflict has been ended. Is it an acceptance of the state of Israel to live in peace with its neighbors, and recognition that it is a state, it's there to stay? Or is it do the Israelis ultimately need a Palestinian acceptance of the right of Israel to be there, or even the right of Israel as a Israel's recognition of Israel's right as a Jewish state? Strikes me that the latter will be very difficult to achieve, but is not necessary. If there is a formal diplomatic recognition with assurance of security that are persuasive, wouldn't a Palestinian affirmation that Israel has a right to exist without going into the historical narrative or accepting the historic legitimacy to reclaim its ancient patrimony? It strikes me that that is more than should be asked and is not necessary to ask.
I don't want to purport to speak for the Israelis or for the Palestinians, for that matter. So, I mean, better addressed to them. But I'll say this because this has struck me over the years. I mean, Oslo was built on the notion of mutual recognition. But there was always this lagging suspicion, I think Hussein mentioned it, in their minds, that ultimately the Palestinians didn't really accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state in that land. And I think they're right. I think if you polled or if you had lie detector tests, even for those many Palestinians who sound extremely moderate, deep down they believe Israel shouldn't be there. And that's something that you may be right that it's not something that Israel should try to convince the Arabs that they have a right to be there, to have peace. But it's been a lingering issue, and it comes up time and time again. I mean, why did Prime Minister Netanyahu raise it? Partly because he believes it, I suspect, but also because he knows that it resonates deeply with the Israeli people when he says, we want acceptance as a Jewish state. I mean, for me, the dueling discourses when you had Benjamin Netanyahu and you had Khalid Mishal responding in a way to the president's speech, both of them saying, we accept a two-state solution, but saying something deeper. One of them saying, we want acceptance as a Jewish state. And the other one saying, well, we reject that and we want recognition of the right of refugees. They were in a way saying, yes, we accept formally the two-state solution, but we're really talking about something else. And that was the level at which their discussion was taking place. So I can't answer your question, what they will need. But I think it's fair to say that this suspicion lingers, and that's the suspicion about the salami tactics, that this is just one stage, and later the Palestinians will try to get more. You need to find a way to address it. Maybe it could be addressed through the mechanisms that you mentioned. That's what the negotiations and the process is going to be about, finding a way to address that concern and mirror concerns on the Palestinian side.
Yes. Not quite in the... Yes. Uh-huh.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Diane Perlman. I'm a clinical and political psychologist and also at the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. And first of all, I agree this is a brilliant panel, and it has much more depth and complexity than almost anything I've attended. So just to further reinforce some of mostly Rob's points, that I think a lot of the reasons for the failure has been psychological ignorance and failure to understand the dynamics and a preference for coercive kind of techniques and reactions that escalate fear, trauma, envy, and humiliation that escalate the. So I think that we need to bring in more actors, but I think we need to bring in certain more knowledge and skill sets, and I think of it in a way as like political therapy or using advanced techniques to deal with some of the very tender reactions, and also there are ways to deal with the right of return, other ways that haven't been dealt with so much. So, and also the way to be more secure is to make your enemy more secure. So there's also a matter of education. So, and also many of the leaders in the field are Jewish and Palestinian people in the field of, say, conflict transformation that we could bring in to bear on this. So I'd like your thoughts, or if you're aware of anything.
Go ahead.
I would offer and please don't take this the wrong way, an off-the-cuff. The issue is not that Israelis and Palestinians do not understand one another. it's arguably that they understand one another too well.
Exactly. I really agree with that.
Number two, as someone who participated in negotiations and hermetically sealed a negotiating process from experts and other points of view, I would strongly endorse the notion that we should reach out to different fields in order to acquire different approaches and expertise for conflict. But in the end, at the end of the day, in the cruel and unforgiving political world in which we live, this conflict is going to be driven by political will and whether leaders can summon up explanations to defend what they've done before their respective constituencies. I know it's hard to fully understand, but I cannot come to any other conclusion. It's not that we don't understand the importance of memory and trauma and historical narratives. It's not that we've lacked, psychological approaches to conflict resolution. At the end of the day, these are extraordinarily tough issues over identity, existential concerns by the two sides. They will and will not, or not be resolved in the cruel, hard, and unforgiving world of the political realities in which they live. These men and women live, including the realities that exist here. So I agree with you. We ought to reach out and we ought to explore, but I'm not entirely persuaded or will ever be persuaded.
That's not at all.
Right, I'm sorry. I didn't want to get into an adversary. I just wanted.
Policies fail because they don't consider certain reactions. So I'm not.
I think there is an emotional dimension to this that is very significant, but I think the only way to address it is politically. So I think one needs to recognize that there's some validity in what you said. There's really a lot of validity in what Rob said about the sources of mistrust and the way people think about it. But I think ultimately the solution is the one that Dr. Miller proposes. You start to meet people's minimum requirements and show them that their mistrust is not justified by taking steps towards realizing both people don't want this two-state agreement in their heart of hearts, right? I mean, I agree. Probably there's a sentiment among a lot of Palestinians that Israel shouldn't be there. I think there's a sentiment among many Israelis that this is our country. As Uzi Landau said the other day, this is our country, and who the hell are these people, these occupiers in the West Bank? I mean, these villagers. What are they doing in our country? I think, at an emotional level that operates, but the way you deal with it is by addressing people, I think, at the level of their interests and showing them that, what they need and what the other side need, not that they want, but that they need, is the same thing, and that they're not both lying to each other, or the other side isn't insincere when they say they want it. They don't want it because they emotionally love the idea. They want it because they need it.
Yes, Michael.
Michael Lame, Rethink the Middle East. If the entire universe of possibilities consists of two, one state or two state, and you knock down one state, then voila, you're left with two state as the only possibility. It seems to me that's a narrow set of options. And partly if you say the requirement is the realization of the national aspirations of both people, then of course the Palestinians must come up with a state, one state or two states or possibly three states. I haven't heard much about Gaza, which is almost like a de facto third state. When you talk about Salam Fayyad and the de facto Palestinian state, that's really West Bank, distinct from Gaza. So, and a one-sentence dismissal of a Jordanian option, I don't think gets at it. So ideas in the Middle East disappear, like the Jordanian option, and also have a habit of coming back around. I can imagine, for example, a scenario in which Hamas comes on strong in the West Bank. The Israelis willing to do a two-state deal with Fatah are not willing to do a two-state deal with Hamas. And people in the West Bank, seeing what's the alternative to Hamas, may look at the Jordanians more favorably.
I mean, you're leaving out the Jordanians.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, but you're leaving out the Jordanians.
I'm leaving out perhaps the Jordanian regime, which may not be the same as the Jordanian people, but I'm not really promoting the Jordanian option. I really use that as an example of saying what's not possible today may be possible tomorrow. So if the entire universe is limited to those two options, we may be missing things.
I agree with that, although the way I put it, because even in your scenario, your other options entail a Palestinian state, or presumably do. I mean, I think even under what I would put under the rubric of two-state solution, we have to think about different ways and different outcomes. But
sure,
my view at least, the by far most likely outcome will be there'll be a state of Israel and a state of Palestine based on the 67 borders. It's hard for me to imagine a solution that doesn't at least take that as a starting point, as others have said. Once you have that, or as part of that, some of the ideas that you mentioned, some of the ideas that one of the other questioners asked, I think those are possible, and those have to be put in the mix.
Two quick points. First, it is sufficient to give a one-sentence rebuttal to that, because I don't believe there's any plausible scenario in which either the Egyptians or the Jordanian, and I say the governments because that's who would decide these things, not the popular sentiment, but the governments would accept to do this. And I mean, look at the attitude of the Egyptians during the Gaza war. They would not get dragged into that under any circumstances. There was no way they were going to allow themselves to be sucked in, and I think there were many different ways in which they might have been, and they were willing to suffer a great deal of internal political pain in order to prevent that. The commitment of the Jordanian and Egyptian governments to not getting back into the occupied Palestinian territories, I think, is an existential one. I do not think they will agree to do it under any circumstances. The second thing is that I don't think, I think in reality, it's not that this debate over two states, one state, or whatever is too narrow. I think it's even too big. I think there's a very simple choice. It's the most stark binary you can imagine. There's a choice between war and peace. I don't think there are half measures and creative solutions that don't involve a Palestinian state that can get us out of a situation of war that goes in cycles of relative calm to relative bloodbath, and that always deteriorates. And not only is the choice between war and peace, the choice is between wars that keep getting worse, wars that keep getting more bloody, and in which the terms of reference have been changing. So that I would point to the most troubling evolution, which is the evolution of religious extremism on both sides, the rise of the Israeli military rabbis and their attitude, the rise of religious extremism among Israelis, the rise of Islamism and Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and worse even in Gaza recently. This is where the conflict is going. If you look at, contrast the first Intifada, the second Intifada, the way things are now, and imagine another one. And another one after that. And I think we know where this is going. Right? And I don't think that's acceptable to anybody. And I think there's your choice. It's really starker than even we were suggesting.
Yes, here in the middle.
Hi, thanks. I'm Rachel Streitfeld. I'm at J Street. I'm wondering if any of you can give the Obama administration any advice for the Mitchell team or the administration in general for creative solutions for the negotiations that they're engaged in now, and anything that we can do or encourage the international community to do once there's been a handshake in the Rose Garden, if that happens, for actual conditions on the ground to change and for the chasm of mistrust to be closed.
I would just offer the thought that at some point this fall, after a trilateral meeting takes place, perhaps in New York, between the president, the prime minister, and Mahmoud Abbas, whether it's a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months later, the administration will face a decision point. And the decision point will expose, it seems to me, and I'm not criticizing what they've done up until now, because I'm not sure what the alternatives would have been for a young, potentially transformative president who wants to be different than his predecessor, whose presidency now rests on a domestic political issue, which really will define whether he's a successful president or not, how different, what else I would advise him. But the gap will be exposed between the notion that anything they've done up until now a moratorium on settlements from the Israelis and potentially consequential confidence builders from the Arabs on normalization will in any way, shape, or form affect the real issue that they're going to have to decide. And that is the gaps between these two men and their respective polities on the core issues will be exposed to be very large. And it is then that the administration will have to confront how to deal with this problem, how to maintain the viability of a negotiating process. Because it won't last very long without something more than just process. And that, it seems to me, will be the key decision point. Will they be bridging proposals? Will they be Obama parameters? Will they be a full-fledged Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement? Will there be a focus on one issue at the expense of the others, on the assumption that the others won't be ignored? That, it seems to me, is the critical choice. And by the way, it's not a transformational choice. I don't see a transformational big bang end to this. It's a transactional choice. Yeah. It's a choice that will be driven in negotiations, but without an American role. And I find myself in the anomalous position of, understanding we can't simply surrender the field, but without an American role, the chances of what Hussein points to, which is the momentum toward something positive, a political resolution. You'll never be able to manage expectations, violence, have any chance of addressing the divisions within the Palestinian polity that now exists. So that's the key moment
I agree.
The administration will face.
Terribly sorry. No, I agree with that. I would only add one small thing, which is that I would urge the administration and all responsible parties take Fayyad's plan seriously. You can go forward on negotiations as much as you can and try to do whatever you can. I agree it's transactional, and I agree with everything Aaron said, actually. But at the same time, Fayyad has opened up potentially, and I think soon it will be practically, and in many ways it already is practically available, a whole other track that is serious and that is not violent and that is pursuant to American national security interests and that can create progress and momentum without there being any kind of diplomatic breakthroughs, if there can't be. And that is a very serious track to be followed. And I think there's a very strong stake in the United States to making Fayyad's approach work. And I think there's a huge role the United States can play in deciding whether it works or not.
Yes. Helena.
I'm Helena Cobbin. Been hoeing this row for more years than I care to remember. I loved Rob and Hussein Aga's stress on having a much more inclusive attitude, policy towards the constituencies on each side that have been marginalized. Actually, they've been treated on the Palestinian side far worse than what you characterized. I mean, the refugees outside of Palestine, some 4 or 5 million of them have been cut off from any decision-making because the decision-making has gone to the PA. So refranchising those people, I think, is very important. And looking at their claims in the ways that you have been indicating is very important. Similarly, the settlers, who are much smaller in number but who've always been very much involved in the politics on the Israeli side, so they haven't been marginalized and excoriated and excluded in the same way that the Palestinian exiles have been. There's been some good work done by Nadim Shahadi at Chatham House regarding the exiled Palestinian refugees. And one of the things he's looking at is, he calls it the right of return for lunch, whereby Palestinians, who live in Syria or in horrible circumstances in Lebanon or in Jordan or in the United States or in the Emirates or anywhere around the world, have this attachment, as you said, to their, home place or to their grandfather's home place and to the mosque or the cemetery or the school in that village, and would love to go and visit their cousins who live there who are Israeli citizens and maybe rehabilitate the mosques or the cemeteries or whatever, and and have lunch. But it doesn't need to be that they go back and become voting members of the Israeli polity, which is what the Jewish Israelis, I think, really fear. So there's a lot of great ideas out there regarding really listening to the exiled Palestinians and what their needs and desires, including, of course, compensation for properties lost in 1948 and the kind of acknowledgement that you mentioned. But do you think that that's actually going to get drawn into this round of negotiations? Your idea that there should be outreach to these constituencies that have, throughout the whole of the Clinton diplomacy, were completely cut out. There was at Israel's behest, a complete exclusion of the Palestinian exiles from the process.
I don't have the answer. I don't know. I mean, it's a very good question. I just take as a reference point the president's speech in Cairo, which I think opened some avenues that may not have been quite as noticed at the time, but I know you noticed them, and I thought that an interesting tone. I mean, one thing that I think people have to bear in mind, even if you want to put the focus on the West Bank and Gaza, which I could understand people do, and stress the need to end the occupation, I suspect that any agreement will have to go through a referendum. And I can't imagine President Abbas or anyone else saying, sorry, the referendum is only going to apply to those people living in the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, again, going to Aaron's point, can he stand up and say this is going to close the conflict when we haven't consulted the millions who live outside? And that's at least one reason why, even from an Israeli point of view, may I say principally from an Israeli point of view, if you want to make sure that this is actually going to end all irredenta, as Aaron said, and close the conflict, you need to bring them in. And that's not happened, and again, perhaps for understandable reasons, but you don't want to have them out there either voting against the referendum or not participating in it, because that would undermine the credibility, the legitimacy, the authenticity of whatever agreement and sustainability of whatever agreement. It's true at a time when the diaspora is not particularly well organized, but let's not forget, and somebody made the point earlier, history changes. That was not the case a few decades ago. They were the center of gravity of the Palestinian national movement. And I just think it would be a mistake, again, from a Palestinian, but also an Israeli point of view, to think of them as an afterthought.
Yes.
Joel Wishigrad, World Media Reports, WMR News. I wanted to talk or ask Aaron, specifically years ago you were director of a group called Seeds for Peace. Well, it was working with teenagers. I still think they have a camp up in Maine. But those teenagers today, when you began, are now retirees. And I want to talk about the economic barriers, the boycotts, the social and cultural animosities. In order to have a state, whether it's 2-state, 1-state, 3 states, whatever, you have certain responsibilities. And you see in some locations, such as Afghanistan, over 40, 50, 60 years or even earlier, it's just out and out tribal groups, whatever. Was the formation of Seeds for Peace specifically to build some of these institutions, take baby steps, whereby on all sides they would work together, build friendships, and obviously it's hardened, and you now have outside forces. Iran, you have a big contentious group coming to the UN in the next 2 weeks, such as Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, even Muammar Gaddafi from Libya, and you see this whole thing being undermined, the whole process being undermined. Could I get comments from the panel, please?
Just a quick comment on Seeds of Peace. Governments do what I call transactional diplomacy, basically business propositions, which are based on balance of interests. And when those balance of interests reflect the real mutual needs of each side, they last. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty is an example which America brokered. The Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, which we didn't broker, we supported, is another example. Oslo was a transactional agreement that broke down. because it reflected an asymmetry of power to which both sides, I might add, contributed. Governments don't do transformational diplomacy. Now, seeds, that's the approach, at least when I was there, that I imparted to this. That, in effect, the transactional diplomacy ends the conflict or reduces the violence and gives people a stake. But that's about all it can do. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty are examples of that fact. They're formal agreements, extremely important. To take it beyond that, however, you need to reduce and end the anger and humiliation. You have to change the role of the occupier and the occupied into something else. And then the transformational diplomacy can begin. The problem with all of these efforts now, including seeds, when it deals with Israelis and Palestinians, is they deal with the anomalies of the dance between the occupier and the occupied. And the dance is a perverse one, it's a pernicious one. It fundamentally makes it impossible on a group basis to change attitudes. So I would argue the real strategy, and America needs a strategy, the real strategy is to do both the transactional and the transformational, to end the conflict and begin to devote more assets and resources to the kinds of programming and efforts required, educational, but also economic as well, civil society, to begin to change attitudes. Both need to be pursued together. Yes, I'm sorry, second row.
Thank you. My name is John Cattell, and I'm a Quaker mathematician. I have two questions. The first is, it seems to me that Christianity is almost as important as Judaism, and it certainly has some strong roots in the Middle East. So the question is, could there be any way for the Christians to get involved in this thing? As you probably know, there's a very large group just recently been formed of various churches to address this thing. And that's my comment on that. Second one, and by the way, shalom and salamu alaikum. The second one is that I have a project with the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency on computerized, using a computer as a third party in negotiations. And we're working very hard on that. And there's a possibility that within 6 months or a year, it'll work. And my comment is, I think we got plenty of time before there's going to be any serious attempt at negotiations.
You know, the Brits used to say that the Jews and the Muslims should get together and solve their problems in a Christian manner. I'm not sure I can offer a comment on. I mean, Christianity has clear equities in this conflict. It is interesting because we do focus primarily on the problem of Jewish and Muslim overlapping sacred space when it comes to discussions of Jerusalem. And I even remember in preparation for the July 2000 summit, there at some point, and Rob remembers, someone who will remain nameless raised their hand and I think asked the president, well, what about the Christian equities? And there are huge Christian equities in Jerusalem. I'm not sure I have a comment on. I'm sorry. I'm not sure I have a further comment on that particular question, but interested in your research project, Jerome.
Jerome Siegel, president of the Jewish Peace Lobby. Rob, I wanted to sort of take you back to sort of tinkering, and in particular the Annapolis round of negotiations, and maybe a focus on. Well, my understanding is that at least one of the gaps that remains has to do with the number of refugees that would actually return, but that was both part of an Olmert proposal, gap both there and in Taba. I'm wondering, I guess, a couple of things. First of all, am I right that the range of numbers that have actually been talked about are relatively narrow? That is, that on the Palestinian side, Palestinian numbers perhaps are between maybe 1 or 2% of the Israeli population. If that 1% would be about 75,000. So if I'm right that the range is really quite narrow, then why wouldn't it be within the capability of the United States to put forward a forceful proposal specifically on the refugees that in fact Israelis could agree to without it actually threatening in any way basic Israeli interests with respect to population?
I think there are two issues at least. One is a matter of principle, and we don't know what standing Prime Minister Olmert had when he made that proposal. Other members of the government, Tzipi Livni in particular, appeared to be against any proposal that would acknowledge return to Israel. So I think there's a principle issue on which, as Ray said, we debated it at length at Camp David, and then there's a numbers issue. But I think it's a principle issue. And if you come back to the notion of how is it going to be explained? How does President Abbas explain what is actually happening to the refugees? Under what heading are they coming back, if they are coming back? And why some and not others? And what is his explanation? And what's the Israeli explanation? That's one of the ones that may be too difficult to forget about, to sort of say, well, we're not going to deal with both sides' existential concerns, because that's really what it is about. I mean, President Clinton's suggestion was to say, let's forget about whether we're going to call it right of return or something. Let's just talk about the practicalities. Compensation, how many will go back, who will go back, and then we'll agree on the title. It didn't work. It didn't work because they were both drawn inexorably to talking about the title. That's what the discussions were at Camp David. They were completely fruitless. Now, I'm told that they went further at Taba, but again, it's unclear who the Israeli negotiator at the time was representing, not his prime minister, it appears. So I don't know that it's simply a matter of let's get a number that's going to be a small number. Olmert apparently proposed a larger number. He then had to go back because it created too much of a firestorm. And I'm not sure that you have an Israeli government, certainly not today, that's going to be prepared to accept a principle under which people would go back. And I'm not sure that the Palestinians would accept at this point a process in which their rights have nothing to do with their going back, and it's simply a matter of capriciousness of who maybe will take a few 10, 20, 1,000 decision that is purely in Israel's hands. So I mean, I think some of the ideas that you and I have discussed about are there categories that can go back? What rights would they have to go back? Would it be right of return for lunch, as Helena said, or are there ideas like that? But ultimately, you're going to have to. President Abbas is going to be able to stand up in front of his own constituency, Fatah, which maybe what they said on negotiations towards a two-state solution was very, very moderate, but they still reiterated right of return. He's going to have to stand up in front of them. He's going to have to stand up in front of the Islamists who are going to make a big deal out of that, and he's going to have to stand up in front of his diaspora and justify the outcome in ways that they can accept, regardless of what the numbers ultimately might be. There was a Palestinian number, as I recall. I'm going to turn to Raith, who probably remembers it better, what the exact number, or maybe Aaron, at Camp David that was bandied around by. But it was a number far beyond anything. That at Camp David, far beyond anything the Israelis could possibly countenance.
One other issue from the negotiator's point of view, and Raith knows this, and so does Rob, that it's trade-offs between issues and among issues that could ultimately give rise to the kind of package approach on the four core issues, Jerusalem, border security, and refugees. And a negotiator is going to look, Palestinian, Israeli, and American negotiator is going to look at the totality of the four core issues in an effort to decide where are the trade-offs. Each issue may well not be resolved on the merits of the case within its own universe. There may be trade-offs between issues, and the one that is most conventionally offered up is the trade-off between Jerusalem and refugees. It's a Palestinian issue to decide how they approach their negotiation, what it is they in essence need. But refugees could easily be used as an instrument for achievement in other areas. Doesn't resolve Rob's problem.
Because I want to comment on that.
Which is the explanation that a politician needs in front of his or her own constituency in order to justify what they've done. That explanation is so critically important to what human beings in all of their endeavors do.
Which is why, I mean, the conventional wisdom, and I agree, I've been part of it, is that you trade between issues. I think we have to at least question that assumption when it comes to issues that have strong constituencies, whether it's Jerusalem or refugees. I don't know that you could really convince the refugees that we're sacrificing their rights because we're getting a foothold, they're getting a foothold in Jerusalem. I just think we have to think harder about each issue being able to stand on its own feet in front of the constituencies that care most about them.
You have territory and security. What you see is that there isn't much margin for trade-off.
Yeah, but what there is positive benefits that otherwise don't exist, as I outlined vis-a-vis the refugees. I mean, if you focus on trade-off, it's not going to work. I agree. But if you focus on what actually is being accomplished, short of the right of return, but much more than what exists now, I don't think it's impossible to explain this, and certainly in terms of what people can do with it once it's achieved. I don't think this is impossible at all.
Yes, over here. I'm sorry. This is my problem, not yours. I figured this out.
I wanted to ask Rob, in terms of the narratives, and you talk about a 1948 currency, a 1967 currency, there's another currency that's on the table, and it's from an Israeli perception, and it's anti-Semitism. And I'm wondering how you remove it from the table. And I'm not asking this as a moral question or a political question, but as a practical question, because it's what keeps Israelis from coming to the table. And the way it plays out, you had most recently in Gaza with the whole issue of UNRWA and teaching the Holocaust, and you see the explanation, well, people in Gaza don't want the Holocaust told because it's part of the Israeli narrative, but it's a sort of nonsensical answer because you can actually plug the Holocaust very well into a Palestinian narrative. You can say, well, it's a European problem, and that's a legitimate way of plugging it into a Palestinian narrative. Or you can say, well, there are lessons we learned from the Holocaust about the protection of minorities, and that could be part of a Palestinian narrative. But instead, they deny the Holocaust. And I think what keeps, going to what Phil Wilcox was raising, the impracticality of getting Palestinians to recognize the existence of a Jewish state, and how do you dissuade Israelis from that? Well, one thing that would move that from the table, I think that the Israelis would be happy with the Palestinians recognizing Israel as any kind of state, as long as the anti-Semitic Holocaust-denying element wasn't there. And so when you talk about 1948 and 1967 narratives, just to, from my personal experience growing up in Quebec, you can talk about the whole tensions between French and English Canada in terms of 1535 and the settlement of Montreal, that narrative, in 1867 and the establishment of Canada, in 1977 and the election of the Parti Québécois. But there's nobody bringing a narrative to the table that says, oh, and by the way, we'd prefer the French disappear. I call that, you can call that the Sixth Sense narrative, in which at the end of the movie I find out I'm dead. So I wonder, how can you get that narrative off the table, which I think would facilitate it for Israelis coming to the table?
I think it's a very good point, and I certainly can't. I'm not going to even try to explain, understand, or let alone justify the position that leaders of Hamas have taken about Holocaust teaching. So I think it's a fair point. I think I think Phil alluded to that in your question too. Are there other ways to get to the fundamental aspirations to overcome the insecurity or the vulnerability and to get a sense of normalcy, Israeli Jews to get a sense of normalcy in the region? That's one of the elements that's going to have to be addressed. At what pace, when it gets addressed, how you do it, I think I don't have the answers to that, but it is one of the mechanisms through which you actually reassure Israeli Jews that they're not viewed as simply a transient presence and that they're accepted. I think it's a very good point. There have been efforts in the past about incitement and education, but obviously the situation in Gaza is different. But it's not just in Gaza, and I think it's something that goes far deeper, and not just in the Palestinian world, but in the region at large. And that has to be, I think, that has to be part of the effort that's undertaken to change the education and to change what's being said.
Let me address this for a second. I mean, I'm obviously not going to defend the positions or statements of the Hamas leaders either. And I would agree that Palestinians, for their own interests and for the good of their own society, the health of their own society, and also for their political interests, can and should do more on the question of incitement, certainly in the areas under the control of the PA. However, at the same time, there are 2 points to be made. One is that you have a lot of ugly rhetoric on the Israeli side as well. I mean, I mentioned Uzi Landau. That's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, that's nothing. Him calling the Palestinians occupiers, you know very well. I mean, it's Amalekites. I don't have to tell you. I mean, there's a lot of very, very nasty stuff coming, and not just from the fringe of Israeli society. So what we're talking about here is a symptom of a conflict. And I don't think it's a cause of a conflict. It might be a barrier to overcoming it. But I really think if you want to talk about incitement, and it should be combated, but the ultimate incitement is the occupation itself. I don't think people who live under the conditions of the occupation really require textbooks and television programs and mosque sermons. The checkpoints speak more loudly than those things. The conditions of life speak more loudly than those things. And so I think that a serious explanation that the only way to restore or create, maybe you could say, any kind of normal relationship between these two societies is to start moving in the direction of peace. And that when people live under those conditions, and when there's been this kind of relationship for a long time, you're going to get these kind of sentiments on both sides, and we have them. And it is not some abstracted symptom of Arab culture or Islamic rhetoric or anything. This is really specific to a situation that could only have produced something like this.
Yes, in the plaid shirt. Yes, sorry. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. My name is Bob Kunst. I'm president of DefendJerusalem.net out of Miami Beach. I hope you don't mind. Somebody from the outside came here. My group has done 141 rallies and 1,000 news interviews to keep Jerusalem united and not divide Israel. And so I'd like to kind of throw some things out, because I feel what I'm listening to here again is, how do you put a square peg in a round hole again for the 9 millionth time, only a variation on a theme. August 9th, Fatah, meeting in Bethlehem with Abbas, came out and said, we don't want just East Jerusalem, we want all of Jerusalem. Hezbollah's got 40,000 missiles thanks to Syria and Iran. Iran will have its nuclear weapon within 6 months. The people of Israel voted for Bibi because of the experience in Gaza, and yet here we have Obama in Cairo coming out and saying, well, we're going to equate the Holocaust with Arab humiliation, while cowardly ignoring 5 Arab wars and 2 intifadas to kill all the Jews. On the other hand, we have Obama saying to Israelis, don't reproduce in areas you've been occupying for 5,000 years. You're only talking about 1948 and completely dismissing the whole history. Or 3,000 years worth of Jerusalem that belongs to every Jew, and every Jew murdered for being a Jew. And by the way, this goes into the whole religious angle on a very major scale. No Jew was allowed into the burial place of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is 2,000 years older than Islam, until 1967. There are many issues here you guys are not addressing and dismissing, and all of a sudden it's all Israel's fault. So I'd like to urge everybody, next June 5th and 6th, we're going to have a giant Million Mensch March here in Washington to focus on all of this, and everybody can start organizing against us. And then at the same time, I'd like to suggest that I think that the Obama administration has been a total, complete, outrageous disaster on this entire thing. I take issue with what you're saying, that is Great Cairo speech. Telling Jews they can't have babies in their own land is racist, it's Nazi, it's genocidal, it's an outrage. And then telling, again, that the UN flag should fly over the holy sites in Jerusalem. By the UN, this is the same group that's allowing the genocide in Darfur of 500,000 black spy Muslims no one wants to talk about, or allowing Ahmadinejad to say, yeah, let's destroy Israel. I mean, I'm outraged that you guys still have a one-sided point of view. It's like 3 points of the same coin. If you really want peace, you're not doing it.
All right. Let me just quickly make 3 points. Number one, no one on this panel has said today or has ever said that this conflict is some kind of morality play which pits the forces of goodness on the Arab and Palestinian side against the forces of darkness on the Israeli side. That's point number one. So nothing that you've heard, unless you've been listening to an additional cassette or narrative that has not been playing here, reflected that. Number two, and I'll make one basic comment on Jerusalem. I don't know if the Arab-Israeli conflict is ever going to be resolved. I have my doubts, particularly on the Israeli and Palestinian dimension, the core. All right? It will not be resolved if one party continues to assert that it has a monopoly on pain, justice, truth, and the accretion of holy sites. All right? Jerusalem is an issue which is going to have to be addressed from the perspective of its life as a city, from the perspective of its potential as a capital for two states, and also with respect to the problem of overlapping sacred space. It's a reality. You may not like it. I may not like it. I live here. Presumably you live here. If the Israelis and the Palestinians are ever going to get to a point where their conflict is going to be resolved, then Jerusalem is going to have to be resolved as well, despite what history teaches us, which is that Jerusalem is to be possessed. That's what, let me finish. That's what history teaches us, that Jerusalem is to be possessed in the name of God, in the name of the tribe, in the name of the nation. It is a city which reflects the spirit of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and yet that city has been bathed in blood as a consequence of confrontation and religious exclusivity and triumphalism. If, in fact, this, by the way, I will have the final word on this because we're gonna move on. And thank you for your comment. Seriously, thank you for your comment. But if, in fact, this conflict is going to be resolved, then it's going to have to include a solution with respect to Jerusalem.
You don't deny that it's open to all now, and it's closed to Jews for 19 years, do you? Isn't it open to everyone now? No.
Of course not. Of course not.
Could you answer that question very
Is Jerusalem open to every...
Wasn't it closed to Jews and all their holy places desecrated for 19 years under Arab control?
Yes, but the reality is if you continue to insist that that is the narrative and that is the only narrative and continue to use history as the Palestinians also use history to justify and legitimate their own claims and the perpetuation of their narrative, there will never be a resolution to the conflict. What I'm suggesting to you is, no, it's not that there's no truth. There is truth. There are two narratives, and both may have actual valid claims. The narratives may well be accurate. The question is, can in fact there be a resolution of this particular issue? I don't know the answer, but it's going to. If the conflict is going to have to be ended, it is going to have to be resolved.
Take someone else's question?
Yes, we should. I think we have time. Let me see.
I mean, let's at least take one more.
One more question, yes.
I don't think that's the right note to end on, frankly.
Thank you very much. I'm Benjamin, too, an independent analyst, and my question is about Hamas. And I'd like the panelists to comment on whether they think that a resolution of the conflict can be achieved in the next few years without Hamas's participation, and is Hamas's participation through some kind of evolution on its part and on the Israeli side, is it more likely now under the Obama administration and its approach to the diplomacy of the conflict than it has been?
Gentlemen, a brief comment by each of you.
Do I think that we could resolve the conflict without taking Hamas into account? I think it's going to be extremely difficult for at least two reasons. One is a practical reason, which is that Hamas has means at its disposal to torpedo a process or derail it if it feels like its interests are not being taken into account. We've seen that in the past. And second, because I think it does represent a constituency, not just among Palestinians, but also in the wider Arab world. And for an agreement to have legitimacy, those constituents are going to, if you want the Saudis, Egyptians, or even the Palestinians, they're going to want to see that a broad segment of Palestinians is represented. So I think addressing the issue of recreating a unified Palestinian movement or a somewhat unified Palestinian movement at some point is going to have to be addressed in order to end the conflict. Now, can Hamas get to the point where it wants to end the conflict? My sense is that today, as we sit, Hamas is not anywhere near accepting the kind of end of conflict solution that we've been discussing. I don't think that it is about to accept the legitimacy of the state of Israel, give up on the right of return, etc., etc. Does that mean that it is a movement that cannot evolve? I don't think so. I think it's shown some evolution, not enough. I think it is today in a position of greater internal reflection and deliberation than it's been in quite some time, partly as a result of Obama's election, partly as a result of the war in Gaza. And I think there is ferment within the movement, but not ferment that's going to produce the kind of answers that people are looking for if they expect Hamas to actually endorse the Quartet principles and join the peace process. I think, just to conclude, this is going to be one of the core challenges of the administration, is how do you find a way to bring Hamas on board one way or the other to deal with a unified, forget about bring them on board, but to deal with a unified Palestinian leadership that can speak in one voice, act in one way, and actually produce, implement, and sustain an agreement. And that's a challenge that they have not had to confront yet. But I think it's down the road, and they're going to have to confront it well.
Well, first of all, there really isn't any question about what entity is legally and technically authorized to negotiate on behalf of the Palestinians. It's the PLO. There is no Arab document, no Palestinian document, no international document that says anything any different. Now, it's true, however, that Hamas represents a constituency that ultimately has to be addressed. However, I think the issue of Palestinian unification is dependent on much more evolution on the part of Hamas of its positions, because in order to secure Palestinian national interests and achieve an end-of-conflict agreement, there has to be an agreement with Israel. And as long as Hamas is taking the position that it will never recognize Israel and, if, in effect, doesn't really want to negotiate with Israel and doesn't accept existing Palestinian commitments, etc., it is not going to be seen as a legitimate actor. And its inclusion in any government will lead to a resumption of the paralysis that we saw in 2006, 2007. So for this to happen, there has to be more movement on the part of Hamas. Now, the question is, how do you move Hamas? There is a point of view here among some of the left and some realists, or self-described realists, that the way to move them is to bring them into the process under the present circumstances. And I think that's absolutely mistaken. The movement, yes, exactly, but the movement that we've seen so far, which is rhetorical, I'm coming to that, that is rhetorical, is really a reaction to two factors. The outreach of the Obama administration, which has, I think, left people like Khalid Mashal worrying that they may be being superseded. And certainly there's a free fall in the popularity of the organization among Palestinians, including in Gaza. So they need to be worried about that. And the more, I think, progress can be made, the more worried they will be, and the more they will have to adapt themselves to accommodate a new environment in which diplomacy is now given a new lease on life. And I think they'll have to look at their positions very carefully. The other thing is that there are elections scheduled for January 2010 to clarify exactly what Palestinians think and the nature of the Palestinian leadership. And I think it's essential that they take place. And I believe that the PA is going to do their best to hold those elections. And if Hamas blocks those elections in Gaza and gives the PA a Hobson's choice about just holding elections in the West Bank or not, they should and must be made to pay the political price for that. And I think we can draw the appropriate conclusions about the depth of their support and the depth of their legitimacy if they're not willing to engage in the elections they've already agreed to in Cairo. That is scheduled for January 2010. Essentially, I think that's the bottom line. But yeah, I mean, Hamas's constituency has to be addressed. But Hamas either has to change or it has to be superseded, and it can be, I think, with the appropriate policies.
I want to thank Rob and Hussein for a fascinating panel, and thank all of you for coming.